Now, before we begin, I would like to ask if you could take a moment to complete a short demographic survey. We'll put the link in the notes, and it's just a few questions and will assist us to build demographic information about those who attend our Safety Connections. Responses are anonymous and no personal information is collected. Thank you. And please refer to the function number on the screen, 233211. And now I'd like to guide you through some webinar housekeeping. Your computer audio is best for this webinar. However, if needed, phone conference is available through the numbers that you received in your email invite. We recommend that you mute other devices in order to avoid distractions. Your microphone will remain muted throughout the webinar, and you will not have the ability to turn your camera on. The Microsoft Teams platform that we're using today includes some engagement features shown on the screen. Please use the react icons as shown to react during the webinar. If the presenters include a poll in their part, you will see a poll open in the screen and on the chat. Please choose your answer and then click submit. You may send your questions to us at any time during the session through the chat feature. The chat can be accessed by clicking on the speech bubble icon on your screen. We will also have time for a question and answer period at the end of this presentation. You may wish to turn on live captions in Teams, which will transcribe voice to text. To turn on this feature, click the More or the three dots button. Select Language and Speech from the menu, and then turn on live captions. You also have the option to view the content of the webinar in full screen mode. The full screen option can also be accessed by selecting the three dots and then selecting full screen from the menu as shown. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please send us a message in the chat. If you're not able to access the chat, please respond to the meeting invite email that you received from WSPS Safety Connection. We have 4 goals for today's Safety Connection. First, to learn, share, and discover what is of value to you, our customers, and our community. Second, to stay in touch and virtually connect with industry peers. Third, to facilitate a best practice exchange within your sector or organization. And finally, to provide you with an opportunity to attend this session from your personal workspace. And now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Kristen Honorato. Kristen Honorato is a health and safety professional with over 18 years of health and safety experience. Kristen joined Workplace Safety and Prevention Services in August 2016, providing health and safety consulting and training programs to companies in Ontario. Kristen holds a designation as a Canadian Registered Safety Professional and specializes in both federal and provincial health and safety legislation, as well as health and safety management systems. Kristen has a wealth of experience in automotive manufacturing, where she has a proven track record of developing and implementing safety program elements, including training sessions, JHSC coaching, health and safety compliance audits, and risk assessments. I'll now hand things over to Kristen to begin today's Safety Connection. I'll be monitoring the chat in the background and will facilitate our question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So Kristen, over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jack, for the intro, and thanks everybody that's joined the call this morning. Hopefully you are all enjoying some really lovely weather where you are. I'm in the Cambridge area, and it is an absolutely beautiful day out there today. So again, hopefully we're all enjoying some really, really nice weather, and we're ready to spend the next hour or so talking together about heat and heat stress at the workplace. So as Jack mentioned, we will be going through some different focus areas today. So we've got a little bit of agenda. So first we are going to start off just briefly describing what heat stress is. We're then going to review some legislation and proposed legislation when it comes to heat stress. We will review some sources of heat as it relates to heat stress. And then we're going to go through some signs and symptoms of illnesses, talk a little bit about the difference in the ways we can monitor heat stress, whether that's a wet bulb or Humidex, go through some controls when it relates to heat stress, and then kind of end that RACE process by talking about how to evaluate your heat stress program. There is going to be some discussion questions as we go through the presentation as well. Again, Jack mentioned we can put those answers in the chat. We'll take a little bit of a pause as those answers come through and make sure that we're reading and responding to all those kinds of comments. Okay, so first thing, making sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to this topic is really thinking and talking about what heat stress is. So ultimately, heat stress occurs when the body cannot get rid of excess heat. So when this happens, the body's core temperature will begin to rise, our heart rates will begin to increase, and this heat stress can result in different heat-related illnesses. We will go through some of those common ones a little bit later on, but ultimately this is why heat is such a concern. Heat, again, has that ability to raise our core temperature. As that core temperature raises, those illnesses related to heat can begin to happen, and our workers and employees can experience some concerns. All right, so legal obligations. Let's chat about this for just a second. So, what, if any, legal requirements do we have when it comes to heat stress? So when you think about, legislation, whether it's the act or regulations, where are we going in that legislation to find out any sort of legal information or legal requirements when it comes to heat stress? What are your thoughts? And again, feel free to start putting some of those maybe in the chat. Okay, so Ronald's got the general duty clause. General duty clause again from Matt. Leah says the act. Greenbug general duty. Yeah, okay, that's great. Those are some great answers that are coming in for sure. A lot of them specifically about that general duty clause, which is a fantastic answer, because ultimately that is where we still are when it comes to heat stress. So right now, as it stands in 2026, we still do not have any specific legislation when it comes to heat stress. We still only have that section 25(2)H or 27(2)C for the supervisor, which is to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance to protect the worker. So that is the only legislation that we currently have for heat stress. So we have been talking about proposed legislation for quite a while here in Ontario. I think it's been about 2 years or so that proposed legislation has been discussed around, again, heat stress, at least for Ontario provincially. There was a consultation paper that came out. That consultation paper was called Protecting Workers from Heat Stress and Heat-Related Illnesses. It went for public opinion. It's gone through first reading. It's been sent out for second reading. But as of now, and as of the update from Christina St. Pierre from the ministry, who is the occupational hygienist with the ministry, not any current movement on it yet. So it still doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. There's still a very good chance that in the future we will see some legislation around heat stress. But right now, it is still under that general duty clause. Okay, so that general duty clause is still where we're going. If an inspector was to come into your facility and they were to look at your heat stress program and potentially write an order around that heat stress program, it would still be under that general duty clause to protect our workers. Okay. All right, so Ministry of Labor, as much as again we don't have any specific legislation, does have a guideline when it comes to heat stress as well. So if you've heard any of my talks before, kind of learned anything about how legislation works, guidelines are not something that you legally need to require or follow. But they are written typically by government or by the ministry, and they always have a lot of really good information, and certainly a lot of information that the ministry would deem reasonable or good industry standard or best practice. So if you haven't ever taken a look at the guideline before, it is called Guideline Managing Heat Stress at Work. It is still a 2019 version, but it is on the ministry's website, and you will get a link to it after the session when we send out some resources. But this guideline does have a lot of great information about heat stress policies and programs, a lot of great information about what the ministry may expect when it comes to heat stress, a lot of information about controls and different things that they could potentially look at. So again, as much as it is not a legal requirement, is a good guideline and something that I would encourage you to read if you're the one that's responsible for heat stress at the workplace. So within that guideline, things that it talks about are, engineering controls around how to design workplaces effectively, suggestions and advice on how to plan ahead when it comes to heat stress, how to help workers adjust to hot environments, suitable personal protective equipment, suitable training expectations, clothing requirements, and things like that. So again, it is a good read if you've got a couple minutes, and you will be receiving that link at the end of the presentation. Okay, so when we think about, again, that general duty clause and understanding, again, that there's nothing like specific in there, there is still some considerations that we do want you to think about around heat stress and creating your heat stress plan. So as part of that general duty clause, of course, we know that if heat is a concern at our workplace, we do need to create a heat stress plan. And that plan really might be developed or attached to the kind of heat it is that your workers are experiencing. So we'll get through this a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. But one thing to really consider, and one thing that the ministry certainly will talk about if they come to your workplace, is deciding, again, what kind of plan is important based on the kind of heat that you're exposed to. So we really break it down into two kinds of workplaces. Workplaces that have what we call process heat and workplaces that do not have a lot of process heat. And the current, I'll say expectation, again, not legally required, but the current expectation is that if you are a company that has a lot of process heat, and again, we'll talk about that in just a second, that the plan for heat stress that you may be wanting to develop should be based on the ACGIH TLV requirements. So again, there's kind of two different ways to manage heat out there. One is through Humidex-based requirements, and one is through the ACGIH. Expectation that we've been hearing is that, again, if your facility has a lot of process heat, then the plan should be based on those ACGH requirements. If you're a facility that does not have excessive process heat, or that process heat is very, very minimal, the plan that you might be creating for heat stress is likely going to be based on a Humidex-based approach. Okay, but again, we'll get into some of the details about that and just as we move on. Okay, so if you have never seen the ACGH or the TLV booklet, this is just a little picture of it here on the bottom. They do put out this booklet every single year. It is purchasable. You can buy it annually if you wish. It doesn't change every year, but again, it is a purchasable book that you can purchase annually. And it is linked to the Ministry of Labor guidelines when it comes to, again, those facilities that have a lot of heat that are related to their process. So there are lots of other things in the TLV booklet around chemical management, exposure to substances, etc. But the heat stress expectations are a part of this TLV guideline or TLV booklet. So again, if you're a facility that is either right now using the ACGH expectations or TLV expectations, Or if you're a facility that has a lot of process heat, and this may be the expectation that you're looking to go to, potentially downloading or purchasing a copy of this booklet is not necessarily a bad idea. So just in case we have any facilities here that are federally regulated, and maybe if you are federally regulated, feel free to put that in the chat. Federal facilities, as most of us are aware, do follow different legislation. So there are different legislative requirements regarding heat stress in the federal space. So ESDC, which is the group that's responsible for federal legislation, does also have a document out there titled Thermal Stress in the Workplace. And they, again, have some expectations too. So within that document that they have, it does state that where work is performed indoors, an employee shall be kept free of exposure in accordance with the TLB booklet. So like I just mentioned about provincially, that kind of expectation that if you have a lot of process heat, you'll follow the TLB booklet. There's some expectations around that TLB booklet, sorry, within the federal space as well. All right. So before we jump into sort of the recognize, assess, control, and evaluate, which is kind of the focus of this presentation, we've got a little bit of a discussion question. I'd love to see some answers or some replies here in the chat. But thinking about your workplace right now and thinking about your heat stress program and that general duty clause to protect every worker or take every reasonable precaution to protect the worker, what are some current things that your workplaces are doing right now to protect workers from the hazard of heat? Okay, good. So lots of things coming in here. Frequent breaks, I'm seeing a lot. Conduct a risk assessment. I love whoever wrote that. We'll talk about that in just a second. Providing Gatorade and electrolytes, more breaks. Hierarchy of control, which we're going to talk about. Cycle jobs, cooling zones, amazing. All right, those are all really great answers and fairly consistent, which is amazing. So it sounds like all of you on the call, or at least those of you that are answering right now, are already doing a lot of things to protect your workers from heat stress, and that's amazing. That's obviously really, really important. It is all about those managing and controlling the hazard and doing our best to ensure that we're protecting our workers from any heat-related concerns. So again, I'm continuing to see the same kind of answers come through, which is fantastic. I love to see that you're all already actively doing some things to protect your workers. Okay, so when we think about, again, the RACE principle, the first thing that we are going to focus on right now is recognizing. So recognizing sources of heat as it relates to heat stress, in really all the different ways and methods that we should be acknowledging and recognizing heat at our workplaces. So the first thing we need to kind of think about or consider when it comes to heat as it relates to heat stress is that there are three sort of large factors or components that all contribute to heat stress and how somebody may be experiencing or exposed to heat stress. So the three kind of big factors that really influence how a person may be impacted by heat or experience heat stress are the environment, the work, and the worker. So the environment's the easiest one, I think. So we'll maybe talk about the environment first. So the environment is truly talking about how hot a workplace is, right? So there's three different kinds of things that can influence the actual temperature or heat in the workplace. First being the true air temperature, right? So the actual air temperature number, how high that air temperature number is. The second piece, I'm going to kind of skip a bullet if you're looking at the slide, is the humidity factor. So as we know here in Ontario, certainly if you're in Southern Ontario, which likely most of us are, we always talk about temperature as a humidex, right? Which is the combination of air temperature and humidity. We know that the more humid it is, the higher the temperature can feel, right? So if it's, 25 degrees outside, which might actually feel like a really nice day, but that humidex is at like 60%, maybe as an example, or the humidity is at 60% or something something like that, then it can start to feel like 32 or 33 degrees out there, which is obviously much hotter. So that air temperature and the humidity value, again, the higher the humidity, the higher it will feel like heat, are huge influences on how a worker will obviously experience heat at the workplace. The third one, or the second bullet, if again you're following along, is that association or contact with that radiant heat source. So I mentioned it already around kind of the decision factor, which we're going to get into a bit more as well. But radiant heat is the heat that is coming because of the process. So if you're outside, radiant heat could be because you're working in like a direct sunlight environment. If it's inside, it could be that the radiant heat is coming from your process. So heat that is caused via running a machine, or heat that happens because you have an oven or a water bath or a smelter or an extruder from plastics or something like that. The actual process that you're doing is putting potentially more heat into the environment. So that's what we consider radiant heat. If you are already in a hot space and then you're also standing in front of an oven, you can imagine how much hotter, right, that workplace may feel in those kind of circumstances. The next factor or sort of area which we need to be concerned about is the work. So the work itself is certainly a concern. And that's again related to really the kind of work, the stress load of the work and where it's done as well. So again, if you're at a workplace where you're lifting heavy boxes all day long versus a workplace that maybe has a computer monitor where you get to monitor machines, the person that's lifting the heavy boxes all day long is going to certainly experience heat in a bit of a different way than the person that's maybe pressing a button for the whole day. Also, again, where that work is happening. If you're lifting those heavy boxes all day long in front of a machine that also pumps out an excessive amount of heat, you're certainly going to feel that far more than, again, somebody that's maybe doing lighter work in an area where radiant heat is not a huge concern. The third factor, and I think this actually, Vivian, kind of leads to what your message in the chat box is there, is in fact the worker, right? So we have to understand that not all people manage or deal with heat in the same kind of way. So the individual worker is a huge influence on how they will experience heat or potentially experience heat stress. So one thing that we will chat about a little bit later on, and it gets a lot of discussion in Ontario often, is whether or not a worker is acclimatized versus unacclimatized. So is this an individual that works in a hot environment every day, all day, and has maybe acclimatized themselves a little bit to it? Or is this a new worker to the facility or somebody maybe coming back that's not used to working in that really hot environment and their body hasn't acclimatized in the same kind of way as maybe some of the other workers have? Other things from a person perspective that can certainly influence how we experience heat is potentially health conditions. So just as an easy example, typically people that are diabetic don't necessarily handle heat as well as others. There's definitely some medication that makes us not handle heat as well as others. And there could be other numerous health factors that have an influence as well. Hydration can also be a big one. So we know that our sort of best control when it comes to heat and heat stress is being hydrated. So the level of hydration that an individual is experiencing, how much water they had in the morning versus how much coffee they drank in the morning could also be a huge impact on how they're experiencing that heat. And then we've got those other personal factors like the clothing they need to wear, PPE, maybe that's extra, that are potentially limiting their ability to reduce their core body temperature also. So as we go through, again, the rest of the slides, we do need to kind of think about these three factors. And I will just highlight that, again, the person part is the most important. We'll talk about some guidelines around maybe when you ought to take breaks or you ought to be implementing things. But ultimately, the big focus here is if a person starts to experience heat-related concern, we need to make sure that that person's responding or reporting and that we're responding to any of their concerns regardless of the temperature that's in the space, right? Where we're going to treat everybody as an individual. All right, so heat stress, again, can be a little bit different depending on the kind of job or industry that you're in as well. Normally, when you think about heat stress, some of our highest concern places are places that do have a lot of that radiant or process heat. So big examples of maybe some companies that have heightened concern when it comes to heat stress. There'd be foundries, steel manufacturing, bakeries, restaurants, glass processing, outside work where there's limited shade availability, asphalt paving, firefighting, as well as many others. Again, there's really heat concerns in all of our workplaces, but the more process heat you potentially have, the higher those concerns can potentially get as well. Any questions before we kind of move on into some of those recognizing tips?
Looks like we're all clear right now, Kristen.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that, Jack.
Sure.
All right. So it says poll question. Oh, it's actually going to pop up. I appreciate that. I didn't realize that was going to happen. So that's great. What do we think about this question? Are heat exhaustion and heat stress the same thing? So yes or no? Are heat exhaustion and heat stroke, heat stroke the same thing? All right, looks like almost all the answers are coming in as no's, which is amazing. So maybe I'll do a follow-up question that can be put into the chat box here. What's the difference? What's the big difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke? Maybe which one's more concerning? They're both concerning, but which one's maybe more concerning? Yes, I'm hearing or seeing, sorry, a lot of people saying stroke is more concerning. That's absolutely true. 100%. Heat stroke is the one that's the most concerning of all. And I did actually read a couple that really were great answering this question as well. So they are definitely both heat-related illnesses. So heat exhaustion, heat stroke, definitely, again, both heat-related illnesses. They both have very common symptoms as well. They're both definitely preventable if we're using the right kind of controls. But the primary difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke is your body's, again, ability to regulate that core temperature. So in a heat exhaustion circumstance, the body is definitely reacting to the heat. It's definitely, again, exhibiting some signs and symptoms of heat-related illness, but it still has the ability to regulate that internal temperature. So it's still working with its processes like excess sweat, etc., to regulate that body temperature. Once we get to the heat stroke concern, we've lost that ability, right? So heat stroke is definitely kind of like the most extreme or final state when it comes to heat-related illnesses. And again, it is at that heat stroke position where that body is no longer able to regulate its core temperature. We've lost that ability to regulate or keep our core at about that 38 degrees. And now we are certainly well on our way to a pretty serious medical emergency. Okay. So clearly we don't want anybody to get to either of these circumstances, but if we are ever in a situation where somebody is potentially experiencing heat stroke, this is where we're getting some help immediately, right? Whether that's 911 or first aid within the facility, but we need some immediate help for sure. So signs and symptoms of some of the more common heat-related illnesses. And again, there's certainly some other ones out there as well, but some signs and symptoms of the ones that we may be experiencing most often. First one, typically happening maybe a little bit earlier on, could be heat cramps. So we probably all felt that before, whether it's, doing some yard work outside, or maybe if those of you like to go for like a run or a jog or whatnot. Heat cramps are those really painful muscle cramps, usually within your legs or abdomen, but can be anywhere, that are happening because of the heat, right? We're either missing too many electrolytes, we're missing too much water, and our muscles and joints are obviously reacting to what that looks like. So again, probably something many of us have experienced before, but heat cramps definitely one potential heat-related illness that could happen to our workers or those of us working in heat. Another one is heat edema. So heat edema is swelling of hands, feet, ankles, really any kind of joint. Again, something that maybe some of us have experienced before. Often when it's really hot out, things like rings get hard to take off, or our feet seem to be a lot more swollen. Again, that's like buildup of fluid and salts and whatnot in our bodies. Another concern or another illness that we could experience from a heat perspective. Moving on into heat exhaustion, which again, we just kind of mentioned, but signs and symptoms of heat exhaustion that people could experience, things like really heavy sweating, maybe starting to feel weak, maybe starting to feel a little bit dizzy, nauseous, vomiting and fainting could also happen. This is, again, where we're starting to get quite concerned about the heat-related illness. It's kind of the precursor to somebody potentially experiencing heat stroke. So signs and symptoms of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, again, are quite similar. In heat stroke, you may also be feeling dizzy, confused, altered mental state, also with that nausea and fainting. But the big difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke is it is in this scenario that the typically heavy sweating has now stopped. So when someone is experiencing heat stroke, they're no longer able to sweat. They're no longer able to, again, keep trying to regulate that core temperature. So their skin will often now feel dry, quite warm. Again, that sweating is classically stopped because our internal body temperature is now so high. Again, this is definitely considered a medical emergency. We need to, without question, get some immediate attention for that individual. Okay. Okay, so recognizing, of course, that we have heat in the workplace is a big thing. Recognizing some signs and symptoms of heat-related illnesses is a really, really big thing. Another really big part of our heat-related or heat stress programs is assessing the kind of heat we have at the workplace and where it's going to potentially be the most impactful to our workers. So another one we can kind of answer in the poll here, or sorry, in the chat. Oh, it is going to come up as a true and false. Thank you. It is important to complete a risk assessment to determine what areas and positions are at a higher risk of heat stress concern. All right, so it looks like we're all on the same page for this answer as well, which is amazing. We're all saying true, it is. So I guess my follow-up question to this one is, how many of you at your workplace have completed and documented a risk assessment when it comes to heat stress? So how many of us have taken on this project of actually doing a risk assessment for heat stress already? Okay, so lots and lots of yeses coming in here now as well. Process of doing so, great. Review it annually, that's amazing as well. Okay, awesome, great answers. I'm glad to see everybody's on that yes side, which is amazing. Okay, so the part of, or when we think about doing a risk assessment, classically done through management or supervisory staff, hopefully with the support of workers in the area and your joint health and safety committee or health and safety rep if you have one, really should again be doing a heat stress risk assessment or a risk assessment when it comes to heat. So the first part of that risk assessment is really determining where it's a concern, right? So identifying the hazard of heat stress and determining where that hazard is maybe more risky. So looking at things like where is the work harder or more vigorous than other places? Where are there spots where we have more process heat than others? Where are there areas where we might have to work in that hot environment for longer than others? Are there areas where there are people that have different vulnerabilities, etc., like more PPE on and whatnot? So we can't treat our whole facility equal when it comes to heat. We really have to do that heat stress risk assessment to determine which areas and which individuals may be at a greater risk of heat stress. Okay. Another part of your risk assessment may also be determining when and how your heat stress program is going to be triggered. So classically, I hear a lot of companies decide that they're going to run their heat stress program through the months of like May to September, right? And that's fair. Those are typically the heat related months. But what does that look like for you, right? When are we going to start really paying attention to the heat in our facility? If again, you've got a facility that's got a lot of process heat, maybe it's equally as hot in October, and we need to continue to be worried in those other months. Could be other things that are triggering your programs. Maybe it's not just that it runs from this month to this month, but maybe we start actively monitoring the temperature at the facility at different, triggers. So examples here, just examples. Maybe we start monitoring more frequently when the humidex at the facility gets to 35 degrees. Or maybe it's when Environment Canada puts out some kind of advisory, or if we have a heat wave coming. So again, within your risk assessment, you should be looking at, again, spaces where the risk of heat is higher. Also things like what's going to start or trigger that heat stress program. Part of your risk assessment, and again, something that you guys are likely all doing is definitely communicating to your workers that there is a hazard of heat, that there is a potentially higher risk of heat stress, and all the controls that you've implemented to try to protect them. So again, we're going to talk about things like training in just a second, but really communicating those results of the risk assessment to the worker is a critical piece of completing these risk assessments as well. And then we have to evaluate, right? We have to evaluate if our program is working. We have to evaluate different work processes kind of on a case-by-case basis. Again, work is not always stagnant. So when we are maybe doing a different task or a different activity, actually, Diana, something that you've kind of put in, I think, to your comment there as well. Every time we think about introducing a new activity, we should be doing a risk assessment based on that activity, and heat should be part of that conversation as well. So maybe we're, a workplace and it's the middle of the summer and we decide that we're going to put up a shed. Well, maybe that's not normal work. We've got to do a risk assessment of doing that new activity, like putting up that shed. And we've really got to think about how is heat going to impact this new activity that we're not used to, or it's not part of our everyday work or everyday experiences. Okay. Part of that risk assessment, again, I've already kind of mentioned, is also starting to really determine which controls are appropriate. Again, not all controls are appropriate in all areas or all spaces, so those really do have to be customized to the area that the heat is a concern, and then ensuring that all those controls and relief measures that you deemed appropriate are in fact being implemented, understood by the worker, understood by your supervisor team, and really are being effective at the workplace. Okay, so kind of jumping back a little bit to the kind of heat program you guys are running at your facility. So I'm assuming no one's going to say nothing. So we'll hope that none come up there. But what is the type of process you guys are currently using to assess heat? So we've got nothing, temperature only, humidex based, or the ACGH requirements. Just wait for a couple more responses to come in. All right, so it looks like the vast majority of us are using the Humidex-based tool. That's not a surprising answer. I find that most workplaces that I visit as well are also using a Humidex-based tool, which is completely appropriate in most circumstances. Again, unless we have to consider in some of that process heat, which we'll chat about in just a second. All right. So for those of you that are on the Humidex-based approach plan, we're going to talk actually about Humidex tool first. So there is, and I'm going to kind of just highlight a link. I'm not actually going to open it right now, but highlight a link. There is a really, really great Humidex-based tool out there right now. It is through OCOW or OHCOW. It is called their Heat Stress Toolkit. And it really is a wonderful tool to really help support developing your Humidex-based, again, heat stress plan. This OCO tool, if you haven't taken a look at it yet, is really again there to help support those companies that have workers that are, kind of doing what we call moderate or average work, not wearing any sort of excessive PPE and don't have any significant sources of radiant heat. So when we think of it again, a Humidex-based response plan, it truly is that. We're looking at the temperature of the facility, we're looking at the Humidex or the humidity, value of the facility, we're getting a Humidex reading, and then we are comparing that Humidex reading to sort of a chart that says at this temperature, this is the extra break or the extra controls we're going to put into place. So it could be, the providing extra water. It could be, again, providing different hourly breaks depending on temperatures, but it's truly based on this is the humidity and the temperature Humidex reading at the facility. Classically, when we think about a Humidex-based approach, we have already selected different areas at the workplace to take those monitoring or those temperatures. We're taking those temperature and Humidex readings or humidity, readings on an hourly basis. And then we are monitoring and providing extra controls based on those levels of heat that are there. But the real thing I'm still going to mention again is that when we think about a Humidex-based approach, it is not taking into consideration the process heat that somebody could be experiencing. So if you do have a lot of process heat, this still may not be the most appropriate tool for you. So other elements, again, when we think about this Humidex based response plan, you can kind of see some of the steps here as well. We definitely want to ensure that we are going through these kind of steps when it comes to making sure our workers are feeling protected. So we definitely want to ensure that all of our workers are trained on our Humidex-based response plan. Make sure that they're trained in signs and symptoms of heat stress and heat-related illnesses, trained in what they should do if they're experiencing concerns, and sort of all things associated with their program. Kind of step two, when it comes to Humidex-based response plan, if you've ever spent any time on that toolkit for OCAL that I just showed you, there is a lot of suggestions around really making some adjustments to your Humidex numbers based on some things that your workers could be experiencing as well. So you may actually, based on that toolkit or some of the suggestions, make an adjustment to your Humidex based on clothing expectations. So again, based on your risk assessment, not all companies are the same in all places. If you do have a space in your facility that is wearing a lot of extra PPE, like maybe a lab coat or a hard hat or like a maintenance style uniform, could be appropriate to actually adjust your Humidex number based on those clothing adjustments. If you take a look again at that tool on that link, and you'll get it at the end, it is a really good job of telling you what kind of adjustments should be made based on the type of PPE that an employee or worker is wearing. Other steps kind of within the Humidex program, again, we mentioned this one a lot too, is doing that risk assessment, making sure that your spaces are appropriate for where you're doing your measurements, making sure that the timing that you're doing your measurements is appropriate, making sure that workers are involved and feel comfortable with where those measurements are happening. Also, even things like determining how you're going to post information, how you're going to communicate what level of temperature and whatnot you're at the facility. Another step, determining what kind of device you're going to use. So most of us are classically using a hygrometer or some kind of, a hygrometer tool to do Humidex testing, but is it the right one? Does it work in the environments that you're using? Not all of them are good for like oily environments and things like that. Are you calibrating it as required? So all those kind of things as a thought process in your steps. You also, even on Humidex-based program, may adjust for some radiant heat. So again, not designed for companies that have large amounts of radiant heat, but maybe for, again, smaller spot radiant heat, you may want to or choose to adjust your Humidex-based plan with that as well. And then step 6 is always considering those additional considerations. So those, again, workers that may be experiencing heat in a different way, those workers that may have to wear, again, different PPE in different areas, those unique activities that might be putting us in heat-related spots for more often than our regular work would require or be done. All right. So the other option when it comes to heat is certainly to follow the ACGH requirements as well. So again, the ministry is certainly highly suggesting the use of a wet bulb globe temperature or widget to measure heat stress when there is a large amount of radiant heat at the facility. So for the small group that's said they are using an ACGH, a widget is the tool that is taking temperatures based on that ACGH requirement, and it does take into account all 3 factors. So it takes into account the air temperature, it takes into account the radiant heat coming from process, and it takes into account the humidity. So it's giving a real view of what a worker is experiencing when it comes to the heat at the workplace. So again, really, really focusing on that, ensuring that the radiant heat is also captured. Okay. This tool can be used indoors, so for indoor processes. It can also be used outdoors for outdoor processes. The widget can kind of do both things, and it's, again, taking into account that radiant heat, whether it's from a machine or from that direct results or direct contact with the sun. Okay. One thing about a widget, if you are using the ACGH, or you should be using the ACGH, or you may be making that change, is that it definitely does take that special piece of equipment, so that widget, and it does take some training and some knowledge on how to use that widget correctly. So it is a little bit more of a complicated program. It is a little bit more of a robust program for sure, and a little bit more, again, training around like the process itself is definitely required. So again, something to be really aware of when it comes to developing that kind of program. Okay. So other just kind of really quick things to talk about when it comes to the widget. So not only does it take into account radiant heat, from a widget perspective, it does also consider things like acclimatization versus not acclimatization. So again, acclimatizing is really when a worker has that consistent exposure to heat, and sort of builds up a little bit of a tolerance to that heat. So even you kind of think about a bakery as an example. If I work at a bakery and I'm standing in front of the oven 6 days a week for 8 hours a day, I've probably built up some tolerance to that heat, more so than a brand new individual that's coming in to do that work. The widget also takes into account the metabolic rate of the work you're doing. So it considers things like, is the work a light task? Is the work a moderate task? Or is the work a heavy task? It also adjusts for clothing, so extra PPE, etc. And again, that is the indoor outdoor that I just mentioned. Okay. So just to kind of wrap up what I just said in those last couple slides, part of your assess when it comes to heat stress is assessing and determining which heat stress method or heat monitoring method is the most appropriate at your workplace. So Humidex-based approach, again, appropriate for lighter to moderate work, no significant safety PPE requirements, and no significant radiant heat. If you have a lot of radiant heat, or again, your PPE requirements are pretty intense when it comes to clothing and masks and what needs to be worn, then the ACGH tool may be considered more appropriate. It is definitely more robust, and certainly the recommendation from the ministry when it comes to those process heat facilities. So based on learning about those 2 tools, before we move on into some of those controls, is there anybody that's using a Humidex-based approach right now that thinks they maybe ought to be using a TLV approach instead? Or are we all still feeling really comfortable with the decision on the tool that we're using? By the way, I didn't mention temperature or nothing, because really those are not going to be considered appropriate tools. We really should be focusing on either Humidex or those ACGH approaches. Okay, great, Brad. You just ordered the book. It's a good book. It's got a lot of great data in there, even just outside of the heat stuff that's included. Great point, Anita. Sorry, I just read that. Anita just said maybe for specific areas. That is an absolutely appropriate approach as well, and probably one I should have, to be honest with you, put a slide in for. You can use a combination approach. If you have, maybe you're a bakery and you have two oven lines, and the oven lines are the only place that has like again process heat, you may absolutely consider using the ACJH approach just for those oven lines. If your packaging department in your office space or your warehouse is very much just like the heat or like the temperature of the air, you could do a combination, right? You could use a humidex approach for the non-process heat areas, and you could use the ACJH for those spaces where that humidex is very much impacted by the radiant heat. Something you would capture on your risk assessment, right? But again, just good that trigger from Adia's comment there. It is more than appropriate to use a combination approach depending on the kind of facility you're in. Maybe that should have been one of my poll responses as well, if anyone's using, sorry, combinations. All right, so let's move on now, and we're really going to start talking about some of those controls that are most effective when it comes to protecting our workers from heat. Okay, so when we think about controls for heat, it's not any different than thinking about controls for any other hazard that we have at the workplace. We are still going to focus on that hierarchy, right? So elimination, engineering, admin, awareness, PPE sort of being the order that we should be following. So of course, actually, we'll talk about this question first. I almost jumped my head a little bit too. I know you guys already gave me some great answers before, so let's just summarize them nicely here. What are some of those really great controls that we are already using? And again, I know that we already put some in the chat, so we won't spend very much time on this. Things popping up, breaks, water, hydration, safety talks, air conditioning, cooling spaces. Great. All great answers. And again, I know that I asked you to guys put this in the chat earlier, so we won't spend too much time here. Okay, so let's talk first about elimination. So elimination, I know feels a little bit challenging when it comes to heat. Obviously, unless we are able to sort of air condition our entire facility, it can be a tough one to implement from a heat perspective. But there are still things that we can consider when it comes to elimination and substitution. So things that we should always consider when it comes to trying to protect our workers from heat in this kind of way is when and how we can perform the tasks. So is there any way that we can perform the task when it's cooler or in a cooler environment at a cooler time of the day? So when we think about, again, that risk assessment, there's a lot of factors in here, right? One of the factors that we want to talk about in the risk assessment is really even things like workload management. So if we classically do this task at 2 p.m., because that's sort of how it's always been done, when it's the heat season, can we do this high strenuous or high workload task at 7 a.m., like on a night shift maybe when it's a lot cooler in the area or a lot cooler at the facility? So really thinking again about that structure and that workload management can really support some of this elimination substitution style. We also want to consider things that, again, would be considered non-essential. So if we're doing tasks and they truly are like non-essential, they're not, critical to the business or our operations, maybe we don't do those on days where heat stress is a significant concern. So kind of on that day to day, we want to think about what does our work look like today, right? It's supposed to be really hot today as an example. Here's what we expected to do today. Okay, well, yes, we wanted to clean whatever the storage area, but we know that's a really hot spot right now. We know that we can bump that to Friday when it's cooler. We should be, again, thinking about heat and the way we're managing our work when we talk about those kind of processes. I don't know, Jess, if you just saw that quick comment, there should be a done answer, but maybe our admin in the background can help you out with that poll not clearing element. All right, so the next one is the engineering controls. So this is probably where we're spending most of our time. When we think about controlling sort of heat stress at our workplace, really trying to get as many engineering controls out there as we can. So engineering controls are those kind of controls that really try to reduce the level of heat that a worker is actually acknowledging or that worker is actually experiencing. So it's things like HVAC, it's things like how many air circulation units you have, it's things like fans, it's things like air conditioners or spot air conditioners or cooling stations that are really again reducing the heat in certain areas and giving our workers a little bit of relief. Okay, so suggestions or questions you can ask yourself when it comes to how appropriate your engineering controls are. So, are you able to improve ventilation, right? Is ventilation something that can be improved? Even this piece can be a little bit about communication. So, a lot of us think that like we'll just open all the doors, right? We'll open all the doors to the facility to help with ventilation, but it doesn't if there's no wind or air movement, and it doesn't if the outside temperature is hotter than the inside temperature, right? So again, things like can we improve the ventilation, and if so, how? Things like can we insulate hot surfaces? So if we do have, again, even small portions of radiant heat, is there a way to put some kind of insulation or some barriers, some covering on it to protect that worker from that amount of radiant heat that's coming off? Do we have equipment again for cooling? Do we have fans in the right area? Are they operational? Are they effective? Are they walking away? I've seen some workplaces, it's kind of really cool. They'll set up like almost a hut, for lack of a better term, but like a little makeshift spot, and they'll buy just one of those portable air conditioners. So if somebody is experiencing heat stress and it's not necessarily time to go to the cafeteria for a break, but they can go into this little hut and get a cooling space or an ability to cool off. They seem really, really effective, and I've heard a lot of great feedback about things like that. Can we put shields or barriers up to protect workers? Even just again in areas where you could have some heat coming off a machine and a screen might just help to protect what that looks like. Is there a way to reduce the humidity? Again, humidity is a big one, right? So the less humidity we can have in the facility, the potential less heat we can have in the facility as well. All right, so the next one is going to be the administrative controls that we need to think about. So these are all of the sort of paperwork style controls. So work practices, procedures, training, awareness, communication around hazards and controls and whatnot that are all going to really help reduce how a person reacts to heat stress. So administrative controls don't necessarily reduce the level of heat, it hopefully increases our level of awareness to heat. So things to think about here, questions that we can ask ourselves here. Do you have a documented and adequate heat stress policy and program? Is it understood by all of your workers? Is it followed by all of your workers and your supervisors? Is it something that we communicate? Is it something that's readily available to review? Is it something that we, have done some training on and whatnot? So really that first focus, do we have a solid, good heat stress policy and heat stress program that is followed and available to our workers? The next one, have we trained on it, right? So have we provided the appropriate training on heat stress and our policies and procedures that includes sort of all expectations. So we should be training on signs and symptoms. We should be training on first aid. We should be training on our program requirements. We should be training on, what to do in case we're experiencing signs and symptoms in ourselves as well as others, right? So all of those, again, really, really critical things. We don't want our training to just say we have a policy and, at these temperatures, we're going to give you extra breaks and that's it. We really want to focus on, again, what we're expecting from our employees, what they should be paying attention to, if they start to experiencing signs, who to communicate to, talk to, and again, really the details of what our program looks like. We also want to hopefully put out or maybe use some kind of warning sign or communication device. So again, we're interested in the chat to see if anybody does things like this. But a lot of companies will, post a different color on their safety board or in areas to kind of indicate where we are. So if we're starting to warm up, maybe you put a blue, placard or something up to say, start to think about hydrating more. It's going to get warm. We're not there yet, but it's time to start really focusing on your water intake. And maybe as it gets even hotter, you put up a yellow one. That's pretty obvious to everybody that says, yeah, here we're inching towards, spots where we have to be more aware of, and we could start to feel some concerns. You might want to start, paying attention to yourself and others. So again, those communications signs, warnings, etc., can be really, really helpful to make sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to heat at the workplace. So again, curious to hear if anyone's using anything like that, maybe even TV screens or whatnot. But I do find them very, very helpful at the workplace as well. Other again, admin ones to really be thinking about. Where are your cool down rooms going to be located? Often it's a cafeteria, could be again an office space or whatnot. Where is our water going to be located? We know that there's other things to consider, right? So if you're a workplace where water is not allowed to be on the production floor, not allowed to be used at the workspace, that's understandable, but maybe we have to set up a water station that's closer where someone's water is a little bit more accessible. Or maybe we're going to allow water bottles with lids that they, can still be protected from chemicals, but something to again consider from that admin style control.
Kristen, I don't know if you saw there was one question in the chat about swap coolers. Do you see that one?
Okay. I didn't. Thanks for that. And Jen, just before I answer, maybe could you write in the chat just a little bit more description of what a swap cooler is? It's actually not something I'm super familiar with, so I wouldn't want to answer probably or incorrectly. So I'll kind of wait, Jen, for you to maybe provide a tiny bit more detail, and then we can talk about it for sure. Oh, homemade AC with fan. Is that what a swamp cooler is? I mean, ultimately, again, I'm still not super duper familiar with what they actually are, but if it's a unit or a device that is cooling down the workspace or the work environment, I would imagine that they would be beneficial, right? Again, I'm cautious because I haven't heard too much about it before, but definitely if it's something that has the ability to cool down a worker, I would think it would be very appropriate to use. Okay, so cooler and a fan that blows through a damp cloth. Yeah, I mean, again, if it's providing cooler air or if it's providing maybe probably a mist or something in that sense, if it is again ultimately reducing the level of heat that a worker is being exposed to or experiencing, then I would say it's probably a valid thing to consider when it comes to your program for sure. My only thought about it, just as I can kind of finish that sentence, would be just be really cautious that wet cloth is not giving more humidity into your facility. I would say that would be maybe the only small caution I would have. But again, the answer is if it's making your workers experience a cooler environment, and it seems effective, then I would say something to definitely continue to look into for sure. Sorry, did I miss anything else, Jack, through that chat as people were bringing things in?
Nope, you got that was the only question. Everything else were just comments.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so actually this one may lean to this a little bit. So the next type of control we do really want to focus on is PPE. Again, PPE is a challenging one for sure when it comes to heat stress, because typically PPE is contributing to the problem and not improving the problem, right? So normally when we think about PPE, it protects us from our hazard. In the world of heat, often the more PPE that we wear, the more exposure we have to the heat stress because it's inhibiting our ability to continue to cool ourselves off. But still things to think about, okay? So again, some that are actually kind of associated to what's happening in the chat right now. So is it appropriate for a worker to use any kind of heat reflective clothing? that is very, very helpful when it comes to extreme heat, at least. If you've ever been into a steel facility, certainly in some of those areas, they look like they're wearing a tinfoil suit or a bit of a space suit. It is very much reflective clothing that they're trying to use to limit or reduce the amount of heat that they're feeling exposure to. Other things like water cooling apparel. So I did see a couple things about that in the chat. That can be appropriate, right? So whether that's like a wet, cloth around your neck, or I've even seen like water vests where like you wear a vest and it actually has cool water that runs through it, which makes your core and yourself feel a little bit cooler. Definitely depending on your circumstance and depending on the hazards that that PP might be contributing to, they can be very valuable at the workplace. Another big one that I don't know if gets considered as often as maybe it ought to, so I'll just quickly mention it here, is allowing your workers to change frequently. So we think about how our body deals with and handles heat, and sweat is our best way of doing that, right? So sweat is definitely the best way to get our core temperature a little bit cooler. And if we're wearing wet uniforms, their ability to sweat is a lot tougher, right? Um, and it makes it a lot harder for our body to kind of release that sweat and get us cooled off. So maybe in heat season, if you're a facility that has to use a lot of like uniforms and whatnot, we give them some extra uniforms and we allow them to change like at that break or at lunchtime. So they're wearing dry clothes again. When as soon as we put dry clothes back on, the ability to sweat's going to improve and increase again, and we're going to have that more increased ability to cool ourselves down or release some of that heat. So again, something to just consider. Again, PPE is a challenging one when it comes to heat, but things that we definitely want to talk about for sure.
There's a couple of questions that popped up, Kristen. I don't know if you want to address them now when you're talking
Sure,
about
Jack, we'll take
clothing. Yeah.
yeah.
So the first one is a welder's clothing considered PPE?
Yes, yeah. So welding clothing is definitely considered PPE. Not obviously to improve from a heat stress perspective. Obviously, it would almost make it a little bit warmer, but we would want to make accommodations for welding clothing for PPE. Typically, it's made of FR rated clothing, right, which is not overly breathable. So we would probably want to be thinking that their temperature is maybe slightly increased if they have to wear a welding style coat or uniform on a regular basis.
Great. And I think just another question back to the swamp cooler. I think you addressed it. Somebody asking if the water cooling fans affect the WBGT and increased humidity.
Yeah, so I mean, if these water fans are increasing the humidity at the facility, it will be shown obviously on your widget, right? So widget is looking at temperature of air, temperature or the amount of humidity in the space as well as the radiant heat. So if those wet fans are again putting more humidity into the facility as an overall consequence, it could certainly impact what that looks like. That's again would be my only caution using them. It could be very helpful at the space that it's being used. It may have an impact on the overall humidity at the workplace. So I would really encourage to take some readings, right? Kind of at spot or near where that's being used to see how much it's impacting it. Ultimately, again, though, if it's still making your workers feel cooler, there's likely some pretty big benefit. I just think adding any water into the air has obviously that potential to impact the humidity that's in the air as well.
Great. And then one final question. Somebody is looking to purchase a widget and there's a huge price range. They're wondering if we had any recommendations.
Yeah, so I know that our hygiene team, I apologize, does certainly have some ones that they would prefer to use. If you don't mind, Jack or Jess, writing that down, I can certainly reach out to some of our hygienists to see if there's some whether they're models or types that are more appropriate than others. Obviously, you do get what you pay for. I'm not sure I would use an $86 one, but understand that 5,000 is a huge number as well. So let's, when we do our final email or even Carrie, if you want to send me an email after, I can certainly get our hygienist to provide some information on some of those best models out there for sure.
Perfect. That sounds great. Thank you.
And then Crystal, I saw your comment there. Buddy system's a great idea, right? Especially when we again want to be looking out for our partners or our neighbors. Again, heat stress, it really is as much making sure you understand your own reactions and symptoms, but also looking at the reactions and symptoms of others. So I love the idea of a buddy system, right? Taking care of each other. If you look over and your neighbor's definitely looking a little bit queasy, that's a great time to be going to your supervisor and saying, like, my neighbor doesn't look like they're feeling awesome. Can we have a chat and make sure that they're being protected? So that buddy system from enemy control is a great idea. And thank you for putting that in the chat as well. All right. So nearing the end of some of our slides, and then again, we want to have time for any additional questions. I am just going to focus a little bit on the training part specifically. So training, can't express enough, is a huge and key part of your heat stress program. It does need to be done for all employees, even for those that may not be in the heat area that often or really at all. Having that training done for everybody is a critical piece. So things to consider when it comes to your training. The results of your risk assessment, right? So really explaining your program, your policy, where your risk assessments indicated high hazard or high concern is going to be a huge part of your training program. It should also talk about things like heat-related illnesses, signs and symptoms, what to be looking out for when it comes to your body, as well as what it looks like in your neighbors or whatnot. How we control them, or the first aid that we should be giving if we're starting to experiencing these kinds of signs and symptoms. Again, IRS, who's responsible for what parts of the program, PPE. So again, which ones can make things worse versus what could be used to maybe help promote and prevent some heat stress. Really that totality of all the things that are included in your program. Again, I know a lot of workers will do training, or workplaces, I apologize, will do training on heat stress. I'm just going to really encourage you to go back and look at the training you're providing and make sure that it is customized and specific to your programs. I know that it's sometimes convenient to do training on like an HR download style platform, and they're wonderful, but we really want to make sure that our training is focused on your specifics and the program and controls that you're using at your workplace. All right, so that's maybe my next question to put in the chat, and again, safe space for sure. So how are you guys feeling about your training programs? Do you feel like it's meeting sort of all of your hopes and intents? Or is there something that you think you might want to add to those training programs that you'd be willing to share? Let's kind of pause as maybe some things pop in. So just more frequent training, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, Alec, I just saw yours there. That OCal, again, website, and again, you are going to get a link to it at the end of this, is fantastic. It's got so many good like posters and charts and like videos and things like that. So yeah, it's a great one if you're just looking to kind of beef up your training with some extra information. Yeah, some great answers. Okay, so we're going to move on and maybe we'll come back to some questions that might have popped up there in just a second. All right, so the last thing that we really are going to focus on is actually the evaluation. So I think that this is sometimes a step that does not happen quite as often as I wish it would in workplaces when it comes to heat stress, but it is really important to evaluate your heat stress program on a regular basis. So just like we evaluate all controls when it comes to protecting workers from hazards, we really need to evaluate our controls when it comes to heat stress as well. So again, things to consider when we're evaluating it. So did it work? Did the heat stress program, was it implemented effectively? Were there appropriate responses? Did we follow it as expected? Did we, take breaks when we were supposed to? Did we have people communicate when they were feeling signs and symptoms? Did we have near miss reports coming in for heat stress? Did we have, employee concerns or complaints about, heat stress? Really, what was the feedback when it comes to that, the implementation of what that program looked like? Other ways, obviously, we can always look at our data, right? So, did we have a lower trend when it came to heat related illnesses? Were there less complaints when it came to heat stress? Did people feel more empowered to report if they felt signs and symptoms? Did people feel more confident in recognizing concerns? Did people feel more confident when it came to like the training and the controls that you're using? So you should come up with some kind of evaluation method to really to determine if that heat stress program is working. Unfortunately, in the summer season, a lot of the complaints the ministry gets is about heat stress programs. And it's not that the companies don't necessarily have them, it's just that they may not be as effective as that company wishes that they were. So we think about again that annual like review, evaluation, what went well, what's not going well, how do we improve this, what could that look like? That's got to really be included as a key part of your program as well. Okay. So just with that, again, if you want to put something in the chat, you're welcome to. You're not expected to, but good time to just quickly reflect as we move into heat season. Um, what we could potentially be wanting to do that could make things better. Okay. So what right now does our program look like? Is there some improvements we think could get made to that program? Again, if you want to share it in the chat, you're welcome, but we'll just give you a quick pause to think about your program moving forward. Okay. So just really quick practice when it comes to the kind of steps to think about. Again, a little bit of a review. First thing we really want to do is make sure we've developed and implemented a strong written health and safety program when it comes to heat stress. You then want to do that again risk assessment, determine what type of heat stress we have, what's the best monitoring system, whether it's again Humidex or ACJH, what's going to be the best suitable program for our facility and the protection of our workers. We then want to train our workers on the program that's been selected, all things included, signs and symptoms, reporting, all those things that we just talked about. Implement some controls and evaluate those the effectiveness of those controls as well. So again, really easy kind of steps to take when it comes to implementing a good heat stress program. Okay. Last thing that I'm going to just highlight quickly for you guys, and then I know that I've got some questions in the chat that I'll let Jack take us through, and if there's any extra ones as well. But we all hopefully are pretty aware that FIFA is coming to Canada, Toronto specifically. It's pretty exciting for those of you that probably live in the Toronto area, or even for all of us that are interested in it. But the ministry has certainly indicated that heat is going to be a big hazard when it comes to FIFA as well. So there has been a playbook created by WSPS called Kickstart Safety Playbook. Within that playbook, and you can get to that using the QR code that's up there, there's a lot of great heat stress resources as well. So as much as I'm promoting the playbook just in a great way from a soccer perspective, there's a big focus on heat stress, certainly for outside work. So if outside work is a concern for your team, that's a really good one to be doing as well. Okay, if it's not working, Anita, you will get a link to the playbook also in your email. So no worries if this isn't working for some reason. The link to that Kickstart playbook will be sent to you via email. Okay. Oh, and thanks, Jack, for putting it in. All right.
I popped it in the chat there. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. So I probably missed some questions, Jack. Are we able to go back to the front, and I'll do my best to get through some of those?
Sure. I think we're pretty caught up, but there's been a few in the last couple of minutes. So going back to your section on training, somebody is asking, does the training program need to include questions and answer segment, or is information sharing enough?
So I would always
that's probably a generic question, right?
Yeah, I would always encourage question and answers in any training session. Just because I kind of assume that if somebody has a question, likely others do as well. So I think just best approach to training in general is allowing for questions and answers, or at least saying, or allowing workers that may not feel comfortable asking questions in large groups, that you're available for any kind of additional follow-up questions, etc. Again, typically a lot of questions will come up about programs specifically related to heat. So if you have the ability to implement that or put that in your programs, that's a great idea.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, what makes someone qualified to monitor medically supervised work?
Yeah, so medically supervised work truly is like through a medical person. That's a really weird way to answer that. I apologize, but like that would make you qualified. So if you had a nurse on site, they would be medically appropriate. That would probably be the biggest one, but likely unless you have some kind of medical background where you truly have that ability to monitor some extreme symptoms, you're not going to be qualified unless you are, yeah, doctor, nurse practitioner, somebody that's got that medical qualification.
Great. What are your thoughts on providing electrolytes like squinchers for workers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily against them, other than, again, there is always a little bit of caution around you don't know everybody's medical background. And classically, things like Gatorades and Squinchers and things have fairly high sugar contents as well. So, like obviously, if you had somebody that had, some concerns with sugar or whatnot, that could be an issue. Um, hopefully they'd be able to regulate that some as well. The best hydrator is always going to be water. So I think that if you chose to just use, cool water, that's always going to be a really good way to let people, obviously stay hydrated. Maybe you put them in as like in your vending machine so people can make that choice. Yeah, sugar-free options as well. That's not a bad idea. Again, I would hate to say don't do it because I know a lot of companies and a lot of employees really, really appreciate it. Just, make sure that people are aware of the contents of them and make sure that your team members make wise choices. If it's not the right drink for them, that there is water available and other options too. So by no means would I say no, just again, make sure people are informed of what you're offering and all the other things that are associated with them for sure.
Great. This is a tough one. How do you deal with people who abuse the micro breaks, cooling periods under the guise of being too hot?
Yeah, that is a really tough one. I'd love
Yeah.
if other people wanted to put something in the chat about that, when it comes to how you guys are managing it. But I mean, ultimately, I think it goes through, making sure that your communication piece is strong, right? And that's got to be a first piece of it. Making sure that people do understand like the program, how it's designed, that if they are experiencing like again symptoms and whatnot, that they're not allowed to just take their own break, that they need to tell their supervisor because if they're starting to experiencing concerns, we want to obviously make sure we're watching them and whatnot as well. And then if it truly becomes a concern, obviously performance management's always a real thing. But really even part of the communication saying that your breaks are not intended to be taken outside. This is not an extra, cigarette break. Unfortunately, people are doing that. Like they need to be taken in a cooler space. There's science behind, cooling yourselves off and whatnot. So I mean, again, I think a lot of it is that strong communication at the beginning, monitoring, right, how those are being used, and if people are truly abusing it, then having some things there for sure.
Great,
Yeah, sorry,
thanks.
Ronald, I saw yours popped up before, and I apologize, Jack. I just jumped in. So
Yep.
you're right. There is that legislation that's been proposed for sure. It has absolutely been approved for second reading. We don't know. We don't know if it's when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. It has not gone any farther yet. So we are still actively watching that legislation. I would say, cautiously anticipate it will come, but we don't have a date. We don't have a second reading. We don't have approved legislation yet. It's very much on what we would call the watch list right now from a legislative perspective.
Great. Well, I think you've caught up on all the questions, Kristen.
All right. Well, if any other questions pop up, we've got about 5-ish minutes left in our presentation. I will certainly stick around for these next 5 minutes. Again, if someone has anything specific to talk about. If not, you will certainly get an email with some resources after. I believe it comes through the Safety Connection one. And I know again that one individual had some questions about the hygrometer. My email will be in that last or that email that you get. So feel free to send me a direct email so I don't forget about that question, and I'll get one of our hygienists to connect with you about the best widgets that are potentially out there.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Like Kristen says, you'll receive a follow-up email with links to resources that were discussed today. Please feel free to share that with any of your contacts. WSPS is here to help, and we'd love for you to reach out anytime. Thanks again for joining, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.